picture of non-proliferation prospects in the region. Today, proliferation concerns look much more serious. Two developments are especially notable: the Iranian nuclear program. Despite the national intelligence estimate, there remain serious concerns about the capabilities of Iran, in particular its expanding enrichment program, as well as its intentions. If Iran develops weapons or a weapons capability, it is widely believed this could result in a cascade of proliferation in the region, a regional nuclear arms race, either virtual or actual. Second, compounding this concern are the recent statements by a number of regional states of interest in nuclear energy for power production. These statements, it must be said, occur in the context of hopes for a global nuclear energy renaissance that many are looking at as a means to address the issues of prosperity as well as climate change. Middle Eastern proliferation, given the significance of the region in strategic economic terms, as well as in terms of some of the politics of violence within the region, is a regional problem with clearly global consequences, among them the challenges it poses to the NPT-IAEA regime. To help us understand the complexity of the regional political and security dynamics, and the prospects of achieving shared goals such as NPT universality and a regional zone free of weapons of mass destruction, among other issues, we are fortunate and honored to have with us today Ambassador Nabil Fahmy. The ambassador of the Arab Republic of Egypt to the United States. He has been in that post since 1999. He's served as Egypt's ambassador to Japan and was a political advisor to the foreign minister. He's been a member of Egyptian missions to the United Nations in the disarmament and political affairs issue in Geneva and New York, and has held many posts in the Egyptian government. He has written extensively on Middle East peacekeeping and peacemaking, as well as regional security and disarmament. I had the pleasure to meet him at a UN conference in the late 80s, where he was a member of the Egyptian delegation. Welcome, Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Robert. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honored to be back at Woodrow Wilson. It's always a pleasure to be here because the discussions are always very interesting, at least for me when I come, in light of the questions that I get. And the center in particular has a reputation of integrity, of a desire to actually deal with the facts and deal with the issues rather than have a debate about them. And that's, again, very useful and, if I may say, a bit unique in the Beltway. But anyway, I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm personally honored to see the chairman of the Woodrow Wilson Center here, Ambassador Gildenhorn. Has been an old friend since, or at least a friend since I arrived here in Washington 9 years ago, and it's always a pleasure to see him and Mrs. Gildenhorn whenever we can meet. One good thing about dealing with non-proliferation, or for that matter, proliferation in the Middle East, especially in the nuclear area, is that it's a lifetime job. When I first decided to join the foreign ministry, I was asked to suggest two areas that I'd like to specialize in, even though our system is not designed for specialists, but they asked the question. So I said Middle East peace process and disarmament in the Middle East. And one of my colleagues said, "You're either very cynical or morbid, because neither of them is going to go anywhere. So that may be your morbid part of it, or you're just cynical, you're looking for a lifetime job." Well, the job still exists. It isn't what it was, frankly, when I started. So one has to be careful with that. But it's still ongoing, and it's still an issue of concern. I'd like to talk briefly, if I can, about how we got where we are today in terms of the problems of proliferation in the Middle East, and dwell very briefly on some experiences, and then maybe make some suggestions and open it up to the floor. First of all, as you all know, at least if we talk about contemporary Middle Eastern history, we've had conflicts ongoing for the last 50 years at least. We had the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then you can add to it every couple of years intermittent conflicts. We happen to have 4 or 5 at the same time now, or 3 or 4 at the same time now. So the conclusion of that is we live in an area of significant tension that tends to be sustained. When that is the case, you are probably going to have an arms race, and probably going to have countries define their security needs in the military sense, primarily, over and above the more general security sense, including economic, social, and political issues. Well, since the early 60s, we have actually had questions about the presence of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. When the Non-Proliferation Treaty was formally adopted and ratified, the debate really was, where would Egypt and Israel go on this issue? Egypt decided that it would sign the NPT but not ratify it unless Israel ratified the NPT, and Israel decided it would not bother to even sign the treaty. For a number of years, again, the issue was mostly Egypt, Israel, but as time went by, you had 2 additional players, Iran and Iraq. By the time we ratified the NPT in 1981, I think it was, Iran already had a nuclear program, which, by the way, you gave it to them here in America, to the Shah. This was not something they built themselves. You were generous enough to provide it. And Iraq, there were questions about where exactly Iraq was going in the whole realm of weapons of mass destruction. And you will remember that just before the first Iraq war, or let me rephrase that, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Prime Minister Shamir and President Saddam Hussein were threatening to use weapons of mass destruction against each other. I forget who started this debate, but Saddam was basically saying that he would use weapons that would burn Israel, and Israel said that their response to any threat, not to the use, would be a strategic one. At that point, we came up in Egypt with the initiative that after having waited for almost 17 years from the initial initiative that Iran had put on the table and Egypt had joined in 1974 to create a zone free of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, we then suggested at that point to have a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological, and their means of delivery. The idea was to try to respond to the concerns raised by the Israelis on the one side and by Saddam on the other side. The next important point in this discussion is, with the emergence of the Middle East peace process in the 90s, the Madrid peace process in particular, we had the bilateral negotiations on political issues and the multilaterals, which included, among the 5 committees, an arms control committee. And at the arms control committee, again, the whole issue of proliferation came up, and arms race and proliferation. And everybody seems to believe that the reason the Akers process, as we called it, failed was because Egypt wanted to discuss nuclear weapons and Israel didn't want to discuss nuclear weapons. That's not the reason, that's the symptom of the problem. The problem at Akers, and I'm going to run through this very quickly, was very few people in that group of countries actually agreed on what we were trying to do. I'll give you examples. The North African countries agreed, supported anything you could suggest on the creation of zones in the Middle East or confidence-building measures and this and that, but their basic security concerns are more towards the Mediterranean and towards Europe, not towards the center of the Middle East or towards the Gulf or towards the Levant. So they were a participant, but not an active participant. And I give you a concrete example. At one point, there wasn't a rather naive agreement to hold joint Arab-Israeli Sixth Fleet exercises on the shores of Libya and Tunis as part of confidence-building measures. And the members of the working group basically agreed to it. I pronounced myself that this is not going to go anywhere. This is going to stop the minute it becomes public because the politics of the region will not allow for this. But since we were the ones who had peace with Israel, I wasn't going to oppose to the particular proposal. And of course, the minute it became public, none of the North African countries agreed to sort of have this kind of debate, and the whole thing broke down. So, and if you go from North Africa to Egypt, for example, or towards the Gulf, our definition of our security concerns was mostly the center of the Middle East, which included Israel and the neighboring countries around the Middle East, and then you move towards Iran. The Arab Gulf areas was, again, part of the Middle East, but their primary interest was Iran, and then the rest of the Middle East. So we were looking in different directions. The second problem, frankly, was Egypt and ultimately Jordan. But Egypt was initially the only country at peace with everybody there. So when we envisaged arms control measures, it was in the context of having been at peace with everybody. Our theme was equal security for all. When Israel envisaged arms control or confidence-building measures, they were not at peace except with Egypt and then ultimately with Jordan. So they were still dealing with conflict resolution. Right? Their vision of the Middle East had not reached where our vision had reached. So consequently, what they looked at as confidence-building measures were much less significant and less comprehensive than what we looked at. The third problem, and consequently, Israelis continued to believe that whatever measures agreed upon had to provide them with a qualitative and quantitative edge. That applies to all the weapon systems, including the nuclear issue. So with those conflicting concepts, it's very difficult to find a common ground. If one's assuming we're going to all be equal and the other is assuming I have to have the edge because I'm still scared of enmity in the region. The third, frankly, issue was there was not a clear understanding or a common threshold, to be more precise, of what the region would look like in the future. We looked at the region as being a region with everybody at peace. In the absence of Iran and Syria in the Akers, Israel could not look at the region and assume that everybody there was going to be at peace with it. So their vision of regional security was in a region that was not at peace with each other. Our vision was of a region that was at peace with each other. And I can go on and give you other lessons, but that's enough on the Akers issue. If you apply those lessons to the policies put forward by Egypt, Israel, and others at Akers, you'll understand why we were unable to ever get an agreement on seriously moving forward. The ultimate stumbling block wasn't that we wanted to have the nuclear issue on the table, and the Israelis said, and only that, and the Israelis said, no, we will discuss only the other issues. The problem was we wanted to discuss all issues. In other words, conventional delivery systems, weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear, and have confidence-building measures on all these issues. while the Israelis were saying, until I have a better vision of the region, we can't deal with weapons that we would need in an existential threat. So, my point that I'm trying to make here is we have tried to put together a package of how to deal with arms control issues, including weapons of mass destruction. And they failed, in spite of our best efforts, because, frankly, you have to understand, you have to have a common threshold of what you actually want to do to put together these sequence of steps. Now, the other point that's important is, as we failed in Akers, as was the case in other experiences, as time went by, the problem has increased. Initially, it was Egypt-Israel. Then we got off the bandwagon of nuclear proliferation. So it was mostly Israel. Then, slowly, Iran started to emerge, but not as a weapon state. Then you had the Iraq non-compliance with their obligations under the NPT and the CWC and so on. And now, frankly, you have the Iranian issue emerging again. And you have a debate which, while is Middle East centric, I think will affect, in many respects, the international non-proliferation regime and the whole credibility of the regime. And I will get back to that. Let me deal, if I may, with the Iranian issue and work backwards. For us, we're concerned about the motivation behind the Iranian program. The fundamental reason being that for a long time they were very reticent about fully complying with the requests made by the International Atomic Energy Agency to explain certain discrepancies in their program. And because they took so long to respond to these questions, they created themselves, they generated a level of distrust or concern that they have to respond to now. I want to be careful here. I'm not challenging Iran's right to full access to peaceful nuclear technology. And I'm not going to get into a debate about limiting their rights. Iran is an NPT member. If it is compliant with the NPT, then it should have the full rights within the context of that treaty. And I think one of the problems with the many proposals that have been put on the table is that people tried to restrict their rights rather than deal with their motivation. We, as a developing country that is non-nuclear, would never support restricting somebody's rights that have been contractually agreed upon, because that could imply in the future that you have a subjective definition of who you like and who you don't, and consequently you limit the rights of those, even though they've made commitments they fulfill their commitments. But again, Iran has raised concerns about their program. Initially because they were late. Now they seem to have fulfilled or responded to all the questions of the IAEA, except the issue of weaponization, which they question that it is at all valid. But they've created the cloud. What we think Iran should do is, in exchange for having assurances of supply, unilaterally agreed to put a cap on the further development of their peaceful nuclear technology for a period of time, not indefinitely. During that period of time, we need to create a better environment in the region to ensure that we're able to deal with proliferation issues in the region as a whole in a much more intrusive manner. The present safeguard system has worked as it was designed to work. Given the concerns in the region, we need to have more intrusive verification systems, and probably those also with a regional bent on them. Now, that's not going to happen if you have double standards or in the absence of the correct environment to push these issues. Again, while I'm saying I think Iran has raised a cloud about its own nuclear program and consequently should look at what they can do unilaterally, I'm not challenging their right to any part of the fuel cycle, for that matter, or peaceful technology as applicable to the NPT under safeguards. How do we create a region that is more amenable to a more comprehensive solution to this problem? At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that the U.S., by the way, had given Iran their first research reactor, as had France given Israel its reactor in Dimona, and I think the U.S. has also given them another reactor. I mentioned these not to be cynical, not to be cute, but I mention them because the reality is politics change, and consequently policies change. Our politics back home will change, and our policies will also consequently change. But on issues of national security of a strategic nature, I can't afford in the Middle East to be dependent on the policies of others. We need to have a equal treatment for everybody, and if that isn't possible or too difficult, then the very least we need to have is a regional arrangement on which the members of the region agree to what they're going to do. At the end of the day, in defining our security, I say this from our perspective, and I think most of the countries in the region, nobody's trying to build up a deterrent, well, maybe the Iranians are, but nobody else is trying to build up a deterrent against the U.S., or for that matter, against Russia. We don't envisage trying to have a capacity to deal with a threat from Russia or the U.S. It's about our neighborhood, our region, the balance of power in our region, possible threats from our region. Therefore, if Iran has ambiguous nuclear program, it has to have implications on the countries around it. It would not be rational, and it would be irresponsible for the countries around it not to read that into their security policies. If Israel has a program that is unsafeguarded and it is not part of the NPT, it is bound to factor in the politics of the countries around it. It may factor in by leading to others going nuclear, or it may factor in, as it has in Egypt's case, by others deciding nevertheless not to go nuclear. However, you obviously see the different trend in the military acquisitions throughout the region because of possible threats emanating in our region. Threats or imbalances, because both of them create political realities. So, I've had a concern regarding the series of European proposals, which some of them were supported by the U.S., not because they weren't good proposals, but ironically because they weren't enough for us. When I'm talking here, I'm talking about the proposals made to Iran. The idea of, well, let's provide Iran, for example, assurances of supply, and therefore they don't develop their fuel cycle and enrichment processes any further, and let's take back the spent fuel and stop at that. Seems to satisfy the West. It doesn't satisfy us. Because we're not focused only on Iran. We believe in the fundamental principle that if we don't deal with these weapons and create a different security paradigm, the arms race in the region will create another problem down the line. And we've said this. I mean, I hate to keep saying this, but since 1968, we've been saying this. If we don't deal with this issue, there will be an arms race. There will be somebody else who wants to pursue nuclear weapons, or who will not join the CWC or the BWC. And that's proven to be true. And it's even gone further than that now, where you have people not being compliant with existing treaties. So, while I think we can ask Iran to apply a cap voluntarily on how they develop their peaceful nuclear technology for a period of time, that would be a senseless proposal if it is not coupled with assurances of supplies, but also a process of trying to negotiate a zone free of nuclear weapons, in particular, if not weapons of mass destruction completely, throughout the Middle East. Because you'd simply be delaying the problem for a couple of years, and it would emerge again in an even worse circumstance. Now, what would make Iran do this? In all honesty, and we have, as Egypt, serious problems regarding Iranian political policy, we're going to have a regional debate about security, as well as a regional debate about proliferation. And I suggest the two of them, which will involve you in America, because you are the dominant superpower in the world, and it could possibly also be useful to have the permanent five of the Security Council, so we can determine our different security paradigms. It will also have to involve dealing with the Israeli program. There's not going to be an end to the proliferation issue without dealing with the Israeli program. Now, Israel has formally said that they support the establishment of a zone free of weapons, of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, but that the reality in the region is not conducive to doing that now. Well, my suggestion is the following. Let's negotiate the provisions of a treaty and negotiate the requirements for it to enter into force. Every treaty you see now, I mean, initially treaties would enter into force if you had, it was a numbers game. A certain number of countries joined, then they entered into force. Then it evolved with other treaties. Well, if certain countries signed, certain numbers and certain countries signed, it would be enter into force. Well, we can come up with a formula where you would have numbers, but you'd also have a set of political parameters as to when this treaty could actually enter into force. Without doing that, we will not be able to develop the intrusive verification measures required to assure ourselves that the Iranian program and the Israeli program have truly become non-nuclear. In the absence of doing that, mark my words, you will have a proliferation problem in the Middle East. It will be worse 10 years from now than it is today, and you will have very few countries joining new disarmament treaties. Again, take my own country. If you look historically, we have been the most progressive in signing up to almost any arms control treaty that was negotiated internationally. We have not ratified a single arms control treaty in 25 years of peace with Israel. This goes contrary to the very logic of how we define our security. We always were upfront in negotiating these treaties. And it's not an anti-Israeli position, by the way. I don't mean it that way. What I'm trying to put on the table here is that even though we're at peace with Israel, there's a point where if nobody else is going to join these treaties, and we're always asked to take the high road, well, there's not much oxygen up there anymore. And it's very lonely. And now, it's not only our our concerns with the Israeli motivation, a country which is at peace with us, and we have frankly, no serious anxiety about seeing why it would be logical for Israel or Egypt to be at war anytime in the next generation, because peace serves both sides. But you have now an Iranian problem that may lead to implications in the Gulf area. It may lead to reactions by Israel, and you have a very dangerous situation in our own region, over and above the implications of what countries having those weapons in terms of their weight politically. To do that, the permanent five, the nuclear states, have to change their posture. Unless you become serious about dealing with the regional problems in the Middle East, you will have a proliferation problem in years to come. So unless you want to deal with this regionally, or what you failed in the past, to get everybody to join the NPT, you're not going to get the members of the region, including my own country, to, for example, accept additional safeguards if others are not members of the treaty. Now, I want to make another point, and then maybe just for 2 more minutes, and I'll open it up for questions. As you said in the introduction, all of this comes, and the concerns about the Middle East come at a point where everybody seems to be interested in nuclear energy, either because we all have energy concerns or because the producers of the technology want to sell it. And I think it's actually both. We started a nuclear energy program, or considered it. The research program was earlier, but the power program was basically thought through just before the Chernobyl accident. And we determined to build 8 power plants because of energy needs. It had nothing to do with proliferation. Frankly, against my personal advice, we joined the NPT because we needed energy. And we went through the whole process of tendering bids for power plants. But the minute Chernobyl happened, we canceled the program. So our interest today is not a reaction to the Iranian program, by the way. And you're all specialists here. I don't know of any state that's developed nuclear weapons from power plants, by the way. If you want to be serious about weapons programs, that's not how we do this stuff. But it does give you a expertise and a knowledge. Anyway, our program was energy-based in the 80s, and it emerged again 2 years ago because of dwindling oil reserves that we see in Egypt, with a highly expanding population, which will ultimately create a very strong energy need in the near term. Now, to deal with that, you basically have either nuclear, solar, or wind, and solar or wind have not been commercially effective in the wide sense. So we will be going out, considering very seriously how to pursue peaceful power plants. And if we feel that we are being limited because of your concerns about Iran and your inability or lack of desire to deal with non-proliferation, then we're really getting into a problem here between friends. You will be taxing those who have been compliant with their obligations, those who have not pursued proliferation programs, and that will have widespread implications. So I think it's a bit simplistic to assume that everybody now is talking about nuclear energy as a step towards nuclear weapons. But it is not an understatement to say there is much more need for nuclear energy in the absence of a commercial alternative, and we're going to start butting heads here if there are restrictions on the wrong set of countries. which tends to be the practice, by the way. If you look at the practice of proliferation efforts over the years, because they've been inconsistent, you seem to punish those who don't proliferate, and those who decide not to join the NPT or to pursue nuclear programs seem to get away with it. And that's going to be a consistent policy. If we continue to do that, we will end up having more nuclear weapon states, or, because it's not that easy, you're not going to sort of turn the key and become nuclear weapon states, or at the very least, you will generate an arms race in weapons of mass destruction that will have serious effects on the security in the region. My last point is the NPT is only as good as we make out of it. It was put together as a treaty that was meant to end. If you read it carefully, it was meant to achieve nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. It didn't set time frames, but that was the objective. That was the political objective. We are trying to reach a situation where nuclear weapons are not on the table. It was extended indefinitely, which is a bit of an oxymoron if one reads the treaty. It would have been much better to have it extended on a 25-year revolving basis. But today, if you look at our security concerns, a country like Egypt in the Middle East, it almost serves no purpose. Everybody we're concerned about who could proliferate, or proliferate in contravention to the treaty or outside the treaty, has actually done that. The NPT was not a deterrent to Iraq when it wanted to violate the NPT, Israel when it decided not to join the NPT, or Iran when it wanted to be a bit suspicious about how it complied itself. The fact that we're compliant, that Morocco is compliant, or that Tunis is compliant, well, these countries have decided in the very beginning to be compliant. So it actually has not solved any of our problems in the Middle East. And it will become more and more irrelevant to our regional security concerns. It will remain relevant to our global concerns. But on the regional concerns, it will become more and more irrelevant. And the regional concerns are those that have priority. I would add that if you add another problem to our perception of the NPT, we already have concerns that it hasn't dealt with our security concerns, put limitations on our rights to access peaceful nuclear technologies, and you're really trying to test people's commitments to their obligations. So, to conclude, I would simply like to say the situation in the Middle East on non-proliferation, or on proliferation, excuse me, my preference always is non-proliferation, so I keep saying that, but on proliferation, it will get worse. I promise you. Whether it's on nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, or an arms race, if we don't deal with the issues. They have to be dealt with primarily taking into account the regional security perceptions and concerns, not those of the superpowers alone. Thirdly, there cannot be a double standard or a security imbalance indefinitely without there being implications on what states do. Fourthly, to move forward on the Iranian issue or on the Israeli issue, we have to create the environment conducive to them cooperating. But we also need to create an environment where nuclear disarmament is topical now. Nuclear disarmament is not topical on the global basis. When I started my career 30 years ago, people were interested in nuclear disarmament. Today, frankly, I don't see the activism, even among the Permanent Five, on these issues of nuclear disarmament. It is, of course, interesting to see very prominent statesmen here in America, Secretary of State, write a letter saying, well, we can move towards a nuclear-free world. And that's a very insightful point. Are these weapons really useful, and are they worthy of their cost, given the threats that we face today internationally? And what's the price of not dealing with them? I argue that in the absence of a momentum on these issues internationally, it'll be very difficult to push the members of my region to take the strong and in some cases risky steps to commit to being non-nuclear. But without having that environment, also I would add, you as states outside the region will not do enough to provide the guarantees or create the cooperation that would ensure people that we're moving in that direction. And finally, I would conclude, and I will stop, seriously, I will stop. Focus on dealing with the motivation beyond proliferation, not on rights. If you try to deal with proliferation problems by limiting people's rights, you will destroy a very weak international proliferation regime that exists today. If you deal with their motivation, we can respond to the issues if we apply the same standards, and also at the same time uphold whatever international norms we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Fahmy. We'll take questions now. There's a Rich. Yes. Yes, please identify yourself and your institution.
My name is, excuse me. My name is Ed Powers. I have no affiliation that's relevant. I appreciate your talk today, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to focus my question on something you mentioned earlier in your talk about the balance there, particularly Israel's view of the balance, interpreted as they presumably have a nuclear weapons capability, which we don't really know about, but presumably they do, and they will not give this up because that's part of what they consider the balance in the entire area. Now, considering in the past their armies, their weapons, their motivation was so superior to their adversaries in the area that they were able to prevail in the wars of the last 50 years. So, and they never, as far as I know, threatened the use of nuclear weapons if they had them. So the balance was achieved, and we are in the situation where we are today. Two things have happened over the last few years: giving back territory, Gaza, giving back portions of Lebanon. Whether they should have been in there in the first place is another story. But they gave them back, and the result has been a more dangerous Israel via weapons, missiles, with greater and greater firepower that can reach soon every part of Israel, particularly the three major cities. The threats of Iran, their nuclear program, the threat of their president, Israeli leaders must...
Could you come to your question, please?
I'm coming.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll come right to the question. With all that in mind, what is the incentive that you would provide for Israel to reduce or somehow put their unknown nuclear weapons program under control? Why would they do that in light of the environment that they have to deal with? Thank you.
Let me paraphrase something that General Petraeus said yesterday. It's not arithmetic, it's calculus. If you look at the Israeli nuclear program, they've had it in one form or the other, at least for the last 30 years. You still had Iraq becoming not compliant and Iran pursue a program. So, in essence, it hasn't really prevented the two main proliferators beyond Israel from pursuing a program. Secondly, what was the nuclear program intended to do? According to Israeli policy, it was intended to be a deterrent against an existential threat. Well, existential threats are basically nation states. Egypt, at one point, Syria, possibly, Iraq, possibly, Jordan as a transit country. Egypt's at peace, there has not been a full-fledged Arab-Israeli war since the Egyptian-Israeli agreement, by the way. Jordan's at peace. Syria has not used force against Israel in any direct sense for a long, long time, even in reaction to things. So what is the actual use of these weapons? Who are you going to deter, Hezbollah or Hamas? Of course not. If you're wanting to deter the people who support Hezbollah and Hamas, for example, Iran, the result has been they've actually been stronger, become stronger rather than weaker, because we have not been able to deal with the proliferation issue generally. So I'm ready to take into account the Israeli psychic, but I'm not ready to take into account a logic that doesn't make any sense. If Israel does not feel that it is comfortable to make the political decision to establish a zone in all of its details, as I said in my talk, let's negotiate a zone and also negotiate the conditions required for it to enter into force. But I'm not ready to accept the logic that you initially said you needed the possible deterrent against existential threats. Well, all of the Arab ones don't exist. So where's the threat? If it's Iran, it's actually this policy that's making it so difficult for Arab countries and others to put more pressure on Iran. So this is not a logical argument. I mentioned also that it's very difficult for countries that have nuclear programs, weapons programs, or at least the ability to pursue them, to give them up. They're a tremendous leverage. Why should they give them up, even if they are not useful? And that's why I put it in the context of regional steps, but also a general movement towards nuclear disarmament. That's what we need to deal with. The Israeli nuclear program has proven to be ineffective. And I think now, if I may say, it is not useful to Israel's security because it is helping or being used as an excuse for an arms race. But we are ready to take into account Israel's psychic in the negotiations. The status quo today is damaging to everybody.
Yes.
Barbara Slavin from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Always good to see you, Ambassador. I wanted to ask if you have any well-thought-out ideas yet about how this regional security discussion might take place. It seems that U.S. efforts to create a GCC +2 to confront Iran have not been very successful. Is there any way that Egypt, which has a peace treaty with Israel and has now had some dialogue with Iran recently, could actually bring together these various parties to talk about this issue? Thanks.
Well, first, let me be very careful here, Barbara. My comments about these discussions are my personal opinions. They're not formal Egyptian government opinions. I don't think that Israel will take any regional security discussion seriously if it doesn't involve the people that it is worried about, particularly Iran, and they also mentioned Syria occasionally. And I don't think that the Iranians will take any regional discussion seriously unless it involves those that they are worried about, which in this case is the U.S. I don't want to mix everything together and we end up having a debate and never get anything done. Proliferation has to be given priority. So my suggestion is we have two sets of talks. One about regional security and how countries operate in the Middle East, and particularly in that area, which would involve all the main players, including ourselves, and the U.S., and I said possibly even the Permanent Five. The other would be specifically on proliferation of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, because they are a very serious. I don't want to get into the national intelligence report, but they are a serious threat that has to be focused on. By having these two sets, you bring everybody to the table. It would be, in a way, an enlarged Akers, but without the excuse of there's somebody there there's somebody missing at the table. One more political and one specifically arms control. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months. We can't put it together without the U.S., for example, wanting to do it. I don't think the U.S. is, frankly, against it, because at one point there was a suggestion to have this kind of conference, but it was Gulf-oriented. My point is it has to go beyond the Gulf. But we'll see. And as I said, this is my personal opinion. It's not a formal Egyptian government position.
Yes.
I'm Carrie Anderson with Oxford Analytica. As you know, some of the concerns have been expressed about Egypt's interest in nuclear energy have also been expressed regarding some of the other Arab countries that have recently been a real increase in interest in nuclear energy. And I absolutely take your point that an interest in nuclear energy does not necessarily mean an interest in nuclear weapons. But I'd like to ask you, to what extent is Egypt, or are you personally worried about proliferation within the Arab world, within other Arab states in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, it depends on what you consider to be proliferation. If you look at the NPT actually allows you to withdraw if there is a national security threat that justifies that. And there's a process where you would submit to the Security Council, I think, and there's a process where you do this. So if a country has a legitimate national security threat, logically speaking, it has the right to secure it, to defend itself. I don't envisage a country deciding, well, country X has now gone nuclear, so I'm going to go out and buy nuclear weapons. It doesn't work that way. But what concerns me is everybody has the right to defend his security. If different security paradigms and threats emerge in the region, you will see reactions. Some of them will be justifiable, even if difficult. But they will be justifiable. If, on the other hand, you're the cause of the proliferation, that's what I don't accept as justifiable. If you're not threatened by anything, and you pursue nuclear weapons because you want to have a position of dominance, that's frankly what I'm concerned of as proliferation. But I don't consider countries that legitimately pursue the defense of their national interests within the legal norms provided to them as being proliferators. But again, there are many, many steps between seeing a threat and going towards a nuclear weapon program. And they're all damaging, by the way.
Yes. Right here.
Michael Adler, scholar here at the Wilson Center. Mr. Ambassador, you said that you were not happy with some of the proposals Europe and the United States have been making over the past 2-3 years. I'm just curious what sort of things you were telling the Europeans and the United States while these proposals were in process, and also how you feel we could go forward from the current stalemate that exists diplomatically.
What we were telling them is basically what I said today. All of these proposals have certain positive aspects in them, but none of them are enough. Unless you deal with the motivation behind the pursuit of these programs, all you're doing is pushing the ball down the road. None of the proposals were meant to deal with proliferation in the Middle East. They were meant to deal with the Iranian problem. Our problem is larger than Iran. And in all honesty, our security concerns cannot be defined by who you happen to like or don't like by way of regimes in the Middle East in the future. So my long answer to your question was we've asked them to add a component to the process without delaying the process, a component to their proposals that would help initiate negotiations on the creation of a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East or universal adherence to the NPT with additional safeguards.
Going forward from
Well, again, going forward, it's the same thing. We would, given the concerns regarding the Iranian program, we would like to see a cap on their development of their capacities, particularly their industrial capacity. At the same time, we would like to have a commitment to start negotiating a zone in which everybody participates in the region.
Yes, in the corner here.
Thank you. Just a quick question about the zone.
Name and affiliation, please.
Matt Rajansky, Partnership for a Secure America. I guess you keep referring to the Middle East as being the zone of concern here. What about Pakistan? That's an issue you haven't mentioned. It's sort of difficult to picture Israel being part of any kind of nuclear weapons-free regime when the India-Pakistan situation remains what it is and Pakistan has what it has. And the second question would be, I think it's Article 6, the obligation to gradually reduce the superpower weapon stocks. Would that have an impact if the United States and Russia and the leading nuclear weapon states made some progress on that front? Do you think that that would at least be helpful for the interim solution that you're talking about in the region if we could get Iran to stop enriching?
Let me start with the Article 6. I think further progress on Article 6 would be useful in creating the environment in which everybody in the region feels obliged to deal with or consider disarmament seriously. Yes, I think it would be an extremely useful step. It would also greatly enhance the international norms on nonproliferation, and that in itself, frankly, would give us a lot more confidence that the international community is going to be serious about these issues. So on that point, yeah. Would they solve the problems? No, because we need to deal with the regional issues. The issue of Pakistan. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that my colleagues thought I was cynical. Well, in our Middle East, we have problems. You want to add a larger Middle East? We can't even solve our own problems. Secondly, the Pakistani-Indian example is testimony to what I'm saying. I was ambassador to Japan, by the way, and I was asked after the Indians tested what Japan could do to. They have a commitment to nonproliferation, and I told them, look, you have a moral obligation, given your own history, to try. But believe me, you're going to fail. Because this is not about Japan. This is about the India-Pakistan relationship, how they envisage each other. So go out, make your effort, and they did. But don't be concerned when you get rebuffed, because it's going to happen. If we don't deal with the smaller Middle East, you will have more Pakistans in that region. But to answer your question a bit more precisely, well, if you have a zone, I could envisage security guarantees. And why am I arguing to get the permanent 5 in the debate? As I said also earlier, it's going to be very difficult to convince those who have the capacity to give it up. And we're going to have to develop a different security paradigm. Using Pakistan or the problems beyond the Middle East as a reason not to do it is like cutting off your nose to spite your face. But your question is valid, and that will have to be resolved in the context of establishing the zone. How do we deal with that concern? Rather than, why should I do the zone until we have that problem?
Yes, at the back.
Dave Ottaway here. I'm a senior scholar here at the center. I'm trying to clarify. Has Egypt definitely decided it's going to build a power plant, nuclear power plant, and who would finance it?
Definitely, the answer is no. What we have definitely decided to do is to go through the whole process of engaging the IEA, looking at our strategic energy needs, the options available to us, and everything regarding financing, environment, safety, and all of that. But the present discussion seems to be, or the conclusion of the discussion seems to be, the only commercial option available to us is the nuclear one. So we're going down that road, but there's no formal official decision to put forward a power, the contracting of a power plant just yet. We have contracted consultants to walk us through the whole process. Financing, we'll get there. I don't know. I mean, the answer is I don't know.
Yes, Ed.
Edward Levine, Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You seem to give rather short shrift to the possibilities for solar and wind power, and to a non-specialist outsider, it would seem that sun and wind were two things that Egypt had a lot of. So why is it that they are so quickly dismissed?
Well, I'm not dismissing them. All I said was that, as far as I can tell, up to now, it doesn't seem that solar and wind commercially are a good alternative to nuclear. David just asked whether we had taken a formal decision. We haven't. I mean, we are still looking at all the different options. We have a lot of sun and a significant amount of wind. We don't have the technology, however. We're buying the technology from the West. The wind technology is from Holland, and the solar from different places. So we're still calculating that. We have not ruled out anything. I'm not aware yet. My personal knowledge is not yet that either of these technologies can provide the kind of capacity that is required. If it proves otherwise, the inclination will be to go with what we have, rather than the kind of investment you'd need for a power plant, for a nuclear power plant. But I just don't know the facts yet.
Yes, right here.
David Arswold from the National War College. Could you discuss public attitudes on proliferation in the region and what influence those attitudes might have on government policy?
Yes, the public attitudes, frankly, are quite sensitive and quite... the attitude of the public is we're being short-shrifted, that there are double standards, that nobody's taking our concerns seriously, that when we were asked to join the NPT or this or that, with promises that others would do the same, nothing happened. So there's a tremendous anxiety regarding that. There's also a marginal attitude, and I say marginal, but you see this in any society. People say, well, if the Iranians have it, and this have it, and this have it, why shouldn't we have it? We're a 7,000-year-old country and a growing economy, so why shouldn't we have that as well? But that's a marginal attitude. All of this will affect government policy, but they will not be a determining factor. The determining factor will be a serious strategic analysis of the costs and benefits of pursuing nuclear power. There is no discussion in Egypt today about pursuing nuclear weapons. So what I'm talking about is nuclear power. And the public is, frankly, concerned about safety and environmental concerns.
We have a question right here. Yeah.
Peter Quayle with the Arms Control Association. Now, the UAE and I believe Bahrain have both, as part of their nuclear cooperation agreements with other countries, have agreed to forgo enrichment and reprocessing technologies. Is this an approach that Egypt sees might be useful for the region as a whole, in addition for itself?
As a whole? Or just the Arab countries?
For the region as a whole.
Oh, sure. As a whole, fine. Just the Arab countries, no. I don't see any relationship between enrichment and the fuel cycle and the Arab world. So if you want to apply any measures you want to everybody, we will take the lowest possible denominator to make everybody feel comfortable and safe. But if it's simply we're concerned about you but not about others, it's a non-starter. You will lose the argument if you discuss our rights. If you discuss our motivations, if people can provide us with a better option in terms of assurances of continued supply, in terms of cost, we will then decide whether we want to have enrichment or a fuel cycle. We may preserve the right, but decide not to do it. But if you want to get no for an answer, debate our rights. If you want the whole region to give up the rights, we'll have a different debate.
Okay. Yes.
Mike Miyazawa. Defense Secretary Robert Gates, in one of his congressional testimonies last year, said Iran is surrounded by nuclear powers. Pakistan to the east, Russia to the north, U.S. Fifth Fleet to the south, and Israel to the west. And in addition to that, two countries that share borders with Iran have been attacked by U.S. military forces in recent years. You emphasized the importance of focusing on the motivation behind Iran's behavior. If the policies of the countries around Iran in general and the policies of the United States in particular have motivated Iran to pursue nuclear weapons program, it's a vicious cycle. My question is, what can you do about it?
Well, again, I'm not going to make judgments on what the motivation is or what's being used as an excuse for. But, Mike, I mean, you raised the point I was raising. We need to have the discussion, an open discussion. Part of it on security generally and relations in the region generally, including with the U.S., because the U.S. is a dominant power worldwide. Otherwise, the Iranians and others won't take it seriously. And we also have to have a discussion of almost the same composition on the nuclear issue per se. And it's going to take time.
Yes. Scott.
I'm Scott Davis with the State Department. Earlier, Mr. Ambassador, you were asked about what Israel's motivation might be to participate in the talks that you advocated, the negotiations. And I think your answer was essentially the participation of Iran and Syria. But I wanted to ask you, you talked about Akers and the Madrid process, and of course that involved considerable progress in the peace process and considerable developments helping to settle political problems in the region. And I think it seems arguable, certainly the Israelis argue, that more such progress would be needed before they would address weapons of mass destruction. So I'm curious what you might think the Israelis might expect by way of political progress on whatever front before. It's hard to imagine. You said yourself nothing of this sort would happen in the next 6 months. Maybe that was a reference to the U.S. political cycle, but I think also one can certainly see the situation in the region and think that it doesn't seem likely for political reasons in the region itself. So I wonder if you have thoughts about what kind of developments in the peace process, such as it is, might be needed before Israel might be willing to join such a negotiation on WMD.
Sure. Well, my opinion is postponing the negotiations itself on a WMD ultimately hurts Israel's security, Egypt's security, and a lot of other countries in the region, because it leaves the stage open for proliferators. And there's no pressure to actually contain what's happening here. What would make Israel motivated in doing this? Israel's public position is, we can't do this unless we're in a state of peace. And I'm working with what they say publicly because I take what they're saying seriously. I don't agree with them. I think that actually doing this helps the peace process. But at the end of the day, they make their own decisions. If their position is they can't deal with this, they can't do this unless it's a situation of peace, what my suggestion is, well, negotiate the details of the zone and negotiate the requirements for it to enter into force. You can then argue, well, a peace agreement with Syria, the regional peace throughout the Middle East, would be steps required to ensure that Israel and the Arab world as a whole would stand up against any possible threats from beyond in that area. You could also argue, from the Israeli side, that, well, maybe we need an even additional assurance from the U.S. or the Security Council or whatever. I would argue, frankly, additional assurances would not be bad, provided they're given as part of a non-nuclear weapon region. If you gave assurances to countries in a region that had nuclear weapons, it becomes actually negative. But let me make a further point. issue really is what helps move the process forward. My argument is the security situation today is different from what it was 30 years ago, before the 73 war, or even, and of course before the 67 war. So the threats posed to Israel, or the perceived threats posed to Israel, then don't exist today. There are different threats today, and you need to develop a different answer to those threats. And I would also add another concern that people tend to sort of ignore. If you read and engage on this issue in our region a lot, and I know we like to talk and there's a lot of debate, and some people worry that as part of a grand package about peace in the Middle East, the carrot being offered is, well, okay, you can make difficult decisions about peace with the Arabs and have to withdraw from certain territories. In exchange for that, you can keep the nuclear weapons. Now, again, we are not a state that looks at Israel as with a sense of enmity. We are at peace with Israel, and we intend to remain at peace with Israel. But that kind of formula would end up to create problems throughout the Middle East, including for us. So we're trying to find a different alternative. And you can't, I don't want to underestimate this point, it will be very difficult, unless you have a traumatic experience like you had in South Africa. It's very difficult, or the decomposition of the Soviet Union, for a nuclear state to decide, I'm going to give up this program. So you have to have the context internationally and the engagement which would provide them with the sense of security, irrespective of the fact that I may not agree with the argument. But if I draw a distinction between my opinions and how I deal with the problems. And I really think it serves Israel's interest, and of course it would serve my own country's interest, and ultimately down the road Iran's interest, if we have a serious discussion about these issues, and then have a discussion about when they enter into force.
That unfortunately has to be the last question. For his lucid remarks and the lively and constructive discussion they engendered, we're deeply indebted to the ambassador. Please join me in thanking him.